All right, so we're going to get started with the part you didn't come to see, which is me introducing the panel rather than the actual panel. If everybody can take their seats, and we know people will filter in and out. Welcome, and welcome to our friends on Zoom. For those on the live stream, we're also thrilled you're joining us. Because of technical limitations, we're not going to be taking your questions, but you're welcome to email us comments afterwards, and we'll share that with the panelists and also use it to help inform future events. I'm Glenn Cohen. I'm a deputy dean and a professor here at Harvard Law School. I'm also the faculty director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. We're founded about 20 years ago in 2005 through a great gift from the Petrie Foundation and Joe Flom. We are the leading center doing work on the intersection of law, medicine, and ethics. And one of our projects is the Project on Psychedelics Law and Regulation, POPLAR, which began in 2021 and expanded in 2023. And it looks at legal and social ethical implications of psychedelic research, commerce, and therapeutics. Our funders include the SciSafe Foundation, Tim Ferriss, Matt Mullenweg, and the Gracias Family Foundation. We're particularly grateful to the SciSafe Foundation for funding this gathering today. We frame today as a relatively simple, I would say maybe overly simple debate. Should we be going faster or slower towards psychedelic access? But as I said, that's kind of too simple. The public discourse sometimes seems to be drawn only to these extreme questions. Psychedelics, yes or no, enthusiast or skeptic, too much hype, not enough hype. And although there are places where these are mutually exclusive ors, we're going to try to bring the and into the equation too and get some really articulated ideas about where things are going. Our goal is deep exploration of a range of very complicated issues. And how do we maximize benefits? How do we minimize risk? How does this fit with existing paradigms? And we have an incredibly exciting group of people here to discuss it. I will say one of our panelists, Joaquin Orozco, was not able to join us today, but we have an amazing group with us. Our moderator is David Plotz, co-host of the long-running podcast Slate Political Gabfest. If you don't already like and subscribe, you should. I listen to it every week. He's also the CEO of CityCast and the former editor-in-chief of Slate Magazine and CEO of Atlas Obscura. Our panelists, in alphabetical order, Matthew Whiz Buckley, the president of the No Fallen Heroes Foundation, the founder of the Sacred Warrior Fellowship, and a Navy Top Gun fighter pilot. You can ask him whether the movies get it right or not after the panel. Holly Fernandez Lynch, Associate Professor of Medical Ethics and Law, Perelman School of Medicine, Carey Law School, University of Pennsylvania, and my former Executive Director at Petrie-Flom. Kat Packer, Director of Drug Markets and Legal Regulation of the Drug Policy Alliance, Distinguished Cannabis Policy Practitioner in Residence at The Ohio State University, Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. And last, David Yaden, Griffith Professor in Psychedelic Research at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research and Principal Investigator of his own lab. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, David, and thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. It's so good to be back at Harvard and hear the word reticulated, which is a word that I always thought was a giraffe. I thought giraffes were reticulated. I don't even know what the reticulated ideas are, but I'm excited to explore them. So this is going to be a discussion, maybe not for the experts. This is going to be aimed for those of us who are civilians when it comes to the questions around psychedelics and psychedelic policy and the law. So, but David, you are one of the world's experts in psychedelic research. So start by orienting us around what psychedelics you are studying and what are some of the most interesting findings you've had so far, or colleagues have had so far.
Well, so I think the first thing to say is, what is a psychedelic? What are we actually talking about? People use that term differently. Some people use it in a very broad way. They are talking about things like ketamine, and MDMA and psilocybin and sometimes even cannabis. So they're using this term in a super broad way. At Johns Hopkins, in my lab, when we use the term psychedelic, we're using it in a more narrow way. Sometimes it's called classic psychedelics. These are things like psilocybin, LSD, DMT. So my plea is that when people use the term psychedelic, they just say what they mean by that term. So I'll just speak in the narrow sense for classic psychedelics like psilocybin. And we use this substance pretty regularly in our ongoing clinical trials at Johns Hopkins and many other people elsewhere. It's in phase 3 trials right now. And I think at this point, it would be hard to say that there's no evidence for clinical signal for some mood disorders and perhaps substance use disorders. But I always try to mention risks in the same breath as mentioning benefits, because there are real risks of these substances which do increase when you get out of the clinical medical research context and into recreational or other settings. So you can't generalize from our findings to those other settings.
And just to clarify, like super basic, these are not legal drugs. The FDA has not approved any of this. This is not, you're not allowed to go to your doctor and get psilocybin.
That's right. No, psilocybin is not FDA approved as a medicine. There are some different legal contexts, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which do provide some access in a legal or decrim kind of context. But no, this is not an approved FDA medication.
So the way we're going to structure this, by the way, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a couple of questions, then I'm going to sort of let them loose on each other and sort of interrupt, and then we'll have some questions from you all in the room at the end. So one more question, David, to start with you. What is the kind of white whale of psychedelics research that you would like? What is something that you were like, it would be so great to be able to study that and to show this?
Okay, here's a boring answer to a really cool question, but it fits with the metaphor you used, which is big. So it's exciting that there's phase 3 studies with 500 people happening. Those are industry studies. What I would love to see is NIH funding medical researchers to do large, rigorous, well-powered studies with active controls, which are expensive but would provide us with information that would be absolutely priceless. So a very large study with an effective active control, that would be what I think would be most exciting right now.
And why does that not happen now?
It's a funding issue. So most of the field has been funded by philanthropy up to this point, and a lot of the philanthropic funding is pretty small studies on a variety of indications. I'm one of the few researchers in the field lucky enough to have an NIH-funded grant to study psychedelics, but it's relatively small. So we've been hearing for many years across different administrations that the NIH will fund this research, and I think we're still waiting to see that happen. But yeah, that's the stumbling block. I think we need large government funding of this research to really understand these substances the way that we need to.
Okay. Kat, let's talk to you for a second. You come to this because you've worked on crafting a path for cannabis to become widely available. So compare cannabis and psychedelics, both from how has that experience shaped your thinking about psychedelics? Is there a stronger clinical case for psychedelics to be more readily available?
Yeah, I think what's important to kind of frame my experience with cannabis is that I largely approach drug policy reform as an issue of human rights. My engagement and introduction to the space was largely 10 years ago through reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, where I read that nothing has contributed more to the systematic mass incarceration of people of color in the United States than the war on drugs. I've spent the last decade trying to unpack what that has looked like for cannabis, and I think part of the translation, not just with cannabis and psychedelics, but with all of these substances, is that in many ways, the drug policies themselves can be just as harmful as the drugs can be, and there are risks that we have an opportunity to mitigate. Part of this translation, just to state it plainly, is that we need to have a conversation around equity and what it looks like to ensure that all communities have access to these substances and that folks aren't being discriminated against or losing legal rights because of their use of these substances. And then as I've continued to engage with cannabis regulators all across the country, and am now engaging with psychedelics regulators. I think part of the translation is that regulators are tremendously important to this effort. They literally serve as the bridge between kind of the status quo and whatever the next step is. And it is a difficult task for folks to try and transition society from a place of prohibition and all of the stigma that we have associated with these substances to a public health centered framework. And so it's critically important that we have folks who care about community, who understand these issues working in government, and that we've got our work cut out for us, because cannabis, like psychedelics, are a Schedule I substance. And there is a huge gap that exists between, I think, where the general electorate and everyday Americans are with some of these issues and where our legislature is.
So on the cannabis question, I think that many of us watched the sort of the rise of these two cannabis economies, one a medical economy, the other sort of a recreational economy. And there was a way in which the medical cannabis economy, which came a little bit first, but a little bit before, became a smokescreen. That it was basically a way for people to, in California in particularly, like people were like, oh, I have back pain. And it was a way for people to get cannabis. Is there a risk of psychedelics going that way?
Yeah, I think that risk exists, but I think it's also important to plainly say that cannabis is a medicine for so many folks. And before there was a recreational cannabis market or adult use cannabis market, or even a medical cannabis market, we had decriminalized these activities for medical patients. I think that part of the challenge that we experience with cannabis, to say it plainly, is that we did often act as if these two markets were the same. You can go into regulated jurisdictions today, the products are the same, they have the same rules and regulations, but there is an opportunity for us to not necessarily address this as if it's binary. I think we need a more nuanced taxonomy of the regulatory options that are available and why folks are actually utilizing these substances. Some folks may be using these substances for medical purposes. Some folks may be using them for spiritual purposes. Some folks might just want to have fun and get high. And I don't think that we should judge them for that. My intention is not to take a moral position on the use of these substances, but when folks are using these substances, how can we do so more responsibly? I think part of the challenge that we saw was the commercialization of the medical industry prior to us transitioning into the adult use space. So it wasn't adult use that commercialized medical cannabis. Medical cannabis was commercialized prior to adult use. And unfortunately, because of some of the ways that these medical and adult use cannabis programs have been implemented, we actually see the exact same actors who are issued licenses to participate in medical be grandfathered into the adult use space. And so it's almost by design that these are the same folks who are engaging in these dual markets. But again, I think the opportunity that we have is to take on a more nuanced taxonomy as we're talking about these issues. And they don't have to be a smokescreen. I think both of these arguments, multiple models, multiple cases for uses, can stand on their own and hopefully coexist.
Whiz, so you are a vocal advocate for increasing access to psychedelics for veterans and therapy for veterans. And in particular, you have worked to found a church in this space. And this is fascinating. I think I would love to hear, what is the church and what does it mean to have a church that is based in psychedelics, and what actually happens? Like what is the service like?
Yeah, man. So there's no way in hell I would have ever thought in my life, a poor kid from South Jersey, South Philadelphia, would be sitting at a Harvard Law Conference talking about psychedelics. There's just no way.
Would have been Princeton.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't get in there either.
Maybe Penn.
But so let me back up because it literally is a journey. 5 years ago, Whiz, if I heard me talking like this, I would have kicked my own ass. But that guy died on a mattress on the home of a floor in Mexico, surrounded by some Navy SEALs and an ex-NFL player. So, like I said, born and raised South Jersey, South Philadelphia. I mean, one of 6 kids, Irish Catholic kid. You know, he made the Pope look Jewish. You know, it just didn't get any more Irish Catholic than the Buckleys. And my middle sister, Monica, was killed by a drunk driver when she was a freshman at Villanova. And it was a hand grenade that destroyed my family. Kind of lost my parents, you know, at that time too. Sexually abused as a kid too. And I bring that up because a lot of folks go in the military, they have childhood trauma. You know, I didn't shed my childhood trauma when I went in the military, and flying fighters for 15 years, 2 tours over Iraq. I ended up burying 16 brothers. And then along the way, I've lost 4 F-18 brothers to suicide, including a groomsman in my wedding, my best friend, Captain Eric Swenson. Beautiful bride, 5 kids, and decided he didn't want to be here anymore. So a lot of military trauma, too. It was a culture of tonight we drink, tomorrow we die. So I can say in hindsight, clearly, I was an alcoholic. Went to Wall Street and could not have been more separate from my bride, my kids, my mission, focused on money. It was an absolute horror. So I was spiraling the drain, and I was probably on my way out the door. And then in 2020, after my last brother killed himself due to whatever, I looked at my bride and I said, you know what, I gotta do something to stop veteran suicide. And I remember standing in my home office in front of a whiteboard, you know, drawing a blank, literally. How do you keep somebody from killing themselves? Help them write a resume, you know, buy a suit, help them pay the rent. I was clueless. And then a buddy of mine said, hey man, there's a group of Navy SEALs and some vets. They go down to Mexico and they do psychedelic assisted therapy, and there's a really cool group going in a couple weeks. Would you want to go? And I said, man, go to Mexico and do drugs with Navy SEALs? You signed me up for that. I had no clue what I was getting into. I mean, I'll give you the cliff notes, but I sat with Ibogaine, and it was the most spiritual experience of my life. I lost my faith for 40 years, easily. I reconnected with my sister, my dad, and my God. If that word doesn't resonate with you, I promise you there's something. There's something. So after 4 decades of losing my faith, on a mattress on a home in Mexico, I reconnected with God, period. 2 days later, as a 52-year-old, I did a flip in the bed on 5-MeO-DMT. I think maybe twice in my life I tried to flip into the pool as a kid, and I landed on my back. I flipped. It was an exorcism. I got home from that retreat, and I said, this is how we're going to end veteran suicide. So we started the No Fallen Heroes Foundation, and for the past 4.5 years, we give grants to veterans, first responders, and their families, because my wife served too. She had to put up with my ass and my trauma. So we have been giving grants, and then about 5 months ago, I said, what am I doing? Ibogaine was a sacrament to me. As a young Catholic, I was told when the priest does, SAT word, transubstantiation, eat my body and drink my blood. Now, if you're not a Catholic, you think, well, it's symbolism. No, it's not. As a Catholic, you are taught that is the actual body and blood of Christ. So Ibogaine and these compounds are sacraments. And some of you in the room are probably familiar with Brian Marescu, great guy. He wrote a book called The Immortality Key. These compounds predate organized religion. You didn't need a dude, a rabbi, an altar to stand between you and source. These compounds can connect you directly. So long answer to your short question, I started an entheogenic church, for lack of a better word. Now, I'm gonna pat myself on the back, so the folks watching, we just had a session on law and legality, and I got to be honest with you, I was jumping out of my skin. Congress shall make no law Now, I'm a political science major, from South Jersey, but Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or the free exercise thereof. I must have an old copy of the Constitution because nowhere does it say the DEA gets to tell me how I can worship my God. How dare you? I served this country for 15 years, defending the Constitution and the First Amendment. My God, I'm going to exercise it right now. How dare you? I'm not applying to worship God. Did Tom Cruise and his spaceship have to go to the DEA to get approval for his religion? Benjamin, get my musket. So I was literally jumping out of my skin like, this is infuriating to me. Nobody in this country can tell me how to worship what I consider God. We're not doing human sacrifices. We're not hurting others. We're not hurting ourselves. So I have publicly, down in Florida, I'm like Governor DeSantis, a fellow Navy veteran. I invite you to come raid one of my retreats. Are you kidding me? So, long answer to your short question, I never thought I'd do this, but these are sacraments, and the healing that I've seen is insane. It's part of my journey too.
And what happens at a retreat?
Our current sacrament that we sit with is psilocybin. So there's a lot of prep work. I treat this like a combat hop. We do briefings. You come up with intentions. You come up with questions. You do your research. I have a 35-page flight manual, for lack of a better word, that we give people. And then we have our stewards that serve the sacrament. And psilocybin, 4-6 hour journey. And then 5%, in my opinion, and my experience, is the sacrament. 95% is the integration, what you do with it when you get home. So this is a serious process and commitment. It isn't, hey, let's just go down to Sacred Warrior Fellowship and take some drugs. My God, no. It is a commitment to God and to Source.
And last question here: is it only for veterans?
No. So the No Fallen Heroes Foundation, we give healing grants to vets, first responders, and families. But another reason I started Sacred Warrior Fellowship was because a bunch of civilians were coming like, hey, how about me? Trauma is trauma. I did a horrible job, and we do a horrible job in the military of trauma shaming or trauma grading. I felt embarrassed. Anybody seen the movie Lone Survivor? Mark Wahlberg? I went to Mexico with Marcus Luttrell, Navy SEAL. And other guys. I did not deserve to be in that room with them. Wrong. From my childhood trauma to my military trauma, trauma is trauma. It's not just combat veterans. Everybody's got some stuff. I remember getting home, and I talked to a couple of my sister fighter pilots, and they said, Whiz, I'd love to heal our trauma and maybe join you on a retreat. And I said, all right, great, here's the details. And they're like, well, it's not from combat. It's from rape and sexual assault. So I kicked over this rock of MST, military sexual trauma. So we have actually helped female and male victims of MST who weren't even near the front line. But you expect the enemy to try and shoot and kill you. You don't expect your squadron mate. So trauma is trauma. Long answer, short question again. But yes, so civilians were like, hey, we actually called it a wingman program. Like they would sponsor one of these veterans, first responders, or family members for healing so they could join them too. And to see those together, and that's why I asked Dr. Dave earlier, like if we're doing any studies on group healing or group therapy, because just as a facilitator, as a steward, holding space at these ceremonies, it's incredible to see the demons and just the trauma be released. And it's just so incredibly powerful. So again, I have no idea what I'm doing here, but I'm humbled and honored to be here. And it's just an incredible, this world, this country would be a much better place if we took responsibility for our healing, period.
So, Holly, this is a very different, this is quite a transition that we're going to make. But it's really interesting because what Whiz is talking about is really something sacred, something communal, something that is not really inside of the medical world. But what you've been studying, what you look at is we have a a regulatory process in the United States to make sure that people get safe medicines, that they are not taking things that could endanger them, that are taking things that will help them. And so the FDA is considering psilocybin, it's considered MDMA. Where do we stand on whether psilocybin and MDMA, try saying that a bunch of times, are going to get approved as medicines that people can use?
So I'm going to actually take a little bit of a step back, kind of following your lead here, because there are different models, right? So you use the phrase spiritual healing, right? FDA doesn't touch spiritual healing, right? That's not part of their jurisdiction. They're focused on traditional medical models, and so there's been, ketamine is used off-label. It's not a classic psychedelic. S-ketamine has been approved, for treatment-resistant depression, right? It's not a classic psychedelic, but we've taken steps in that direction. Now, infamously, MDMA was not approved last year. There were, shrieks of horror. We thought this product, it had two positive phase 3 studies. Typically, that's enough to get you over the threshold of FDA approval. It wasn't in this example. And actually, when FDA doesn't grant approval, it issues a complete response letter. Typically, they don't make those public, but they did recently. And so if you look at that complete response letter, it wasn't secret. There was a public advisory committee meeting, kind of tell where the wind was blowing. They basically said to the company, we told you to do things one way, you went off and did your own thing, you didn't prove to our satisfaction that the product can be used safely, and so you don't get approval, go keep studying it and come back to us. They didn't say we're never going to approve it. They didn't say we oppose psychedelic medicines. Far to the contrary. In fact, they've issued guidance about how to study these medicines, how to deal with some of the unique challenges of designing these studies that have to do with unblinding, how do you evaluate adverse events, what counts as an adverse event. So FDA, I think, is capable of doing this. There was just news earlier this week that for psilocybin, it looks like the trajectory is going to be even faster than had originally been anticipated. So Compass is developing a synthetic psilocybin product. They have had some positive data already. FDA has agreed to accept their data on a rolling review basis, meaning that should speed up the review process. I don't know whether FDA will approve it, right? I mean, everyone thought that the Lykos MDMA product was going to get approved, so strange things can happen. We don't know what will happen with Compass's second phase 3 study. But there's a lot of tension in the psychedelic community about what the right pathway is. And so I kind of come at this with what I think is a pretty straightforward principle, although it's controversial, I think, in this community, which is if you're making medical claims, then you should have to prove those medical claims. We should hold psychedelic medicines, psychedelic drugs, to the same standard as other medicines. So I've been in a similar position before where I've sat next to dying ALS patients or family members, and they look at me and they say, "You're evil. Why don't you want my family member to have access to this medicine that I think is going to benefit me?" And that's actually not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying there's actually lots of different pathways. But what's most important for people who believe that they are going to get a medical benefit is that we have evidence to show them, here's the likelihood that you're going to get that benefit. Here's the dose that you need. Here's the conditions that it can be used for. Here's how it can be used safely, right? And that's what the FDA model is designed to produce. Evidence that the product is safe and effective, then insurers can rely on that evidence, and that really does help, to the point of equity, make these things more accessible. It's not going to be perfect access. We have all sorts of challenges getting access to FDA-approved medicines, but that's the model that I think makes the most sense when you're making medical claims about these drugs.
I want to dig into that question more in a second with David, but before we get to that, I think anyone who has been alive and sentient in Washington, D.C., where I live, is aware that the FDA of whatever it is, November 5th, 2025, is not quite the same FDA that it was a year ago. Yeah. And so is the Kennedy, Trump, Maha group that now is setting health policy, FDA policy in this country, is that a pro-psychedelic group? And if so, why?
Yeah, a very pro-psychedelic group. I mean, I think this is probably the most favorable FDA could possibly be with regard to psychedelic medicines. And, I do other work related to FDA, and the concern generally has been that the trajectory might be reducing standards around safety and efficacy. The other thing that we're seeing in this FDA right now is a lot of politicization of the process, right? So if you have the Secretary of HHS saying, that previously FDA had been engaged in aggressive suppression of psychedelics, and you have the current FDA commissioner saying, these things look pretty good, we want to get them reviewed quickly, you might then wonder, are they going to look the other way if some of the evidence is not strong, right? For the Lykos product, I think there was a letter signed by 80 members of Congress sent to FDA in favor of approving the drug. Had they gone through all of the data? Had they studied the trial design? No, right? They were lobbying based on what they were hearing from their constituents. And so that's a major risk here, that there's so much advocacy around psychedelic medicines that it could influence the scientific assessment of the product, right? And so most important is that if you have an FDA-approved drug, that should mean we know it's safe and effective, not that means a lot of people were advocating for the product to get approved.
All right, I want to ask David one more question, and then I want you guys to start talking to each other more. So you were talking in the earlier session in there about the problem of doing randomized controlled trials for psychedelics, for psilocybin. I wonder if you could explain that, because it does seem obvious if you've taken psilocybin, it has a pretty, you notice it. And so it might be difficult to give somebody a placebo because they might be like, that had no effect on me. So how do you do that? How do you get over this problem? What is the problem? How do you get over it?
Yeah, so as a scientist, we're not for or against psychedelics. We want to report the facts and produce knowledge, the risks and the benefits, and the risk-benefit profile. And in order to do that, you really want to be able to randomize people to one condition where they're getting the full dose of the real thing, the psychedelic under study, say psilocybin. And then what you'd really want is another condition where those participants think that they have gotten the real thing, the psilocybin. And that controls for expectancies. So then you're getting closer to detecting the real drug effect, not just whether someone feels glad that they got in the experimental condition for this new interesting compound, or disappointed because they feel like they're in the control group. I'm optimistic that we can address this issue scientifically. I don't think there should be raising or lowering of standards for psychedelics. And this is not a unique problem for psychedelics. All psychotherapy research, for example, has this issue, and many other substances as well. We just don't talk about those as much because psychedelics are in the limelight. So I do think that we can get active controls, as we call them, that are that allow people to wonder whether they're in the experimental or the control condition. This can be done with lower doses, and it can be done with other compounds. The problem or the challenge is that increases the cost of the study. And so we're at a point now where philanthropy can't really get up to the level that we need it to be. Only pharmaceutical companies are at this level where they can do these big studies. So again, we really need, I think, government funding or other very large sources of funding to do these pivotal large trials that will allow us to really understand this issue and to address this functional unblinding issue. That is a real problem, but I do think that it's surmountable scientifically.
Okay. I mean, I can keep asking you questions, but is there anything, Kat, is there anything that you're curious about from one of your co-panelists here?
Yeah, sure. I think, at least with my advocacy, I'd like for decriminalization to be the centerpiece. And I recognize that there are different models that we are familiar with and advocate for. I'm curious if folks feel as though some of the harm reduction measures, risk mitigation strategies that are existent in clinical trials and in other spaces can be brought outside of those spaces and implemented to reduce risk for folks who will not have access through those pathways.
I mean, I should have started by saying I'm all for decriminalization across the board, right? Regardless of what path we take to approval and access, for reasons that you know better than anyone, right? The criminalization of these substances is not helping anyone. It's not keeping anyone safe. It's not gathering data, right? So I think that one's probably, I won't speak for others on the panel, something that we likely agree on.
Can I actually ask, sorry to interrupt you, Holly, but like, I mean, David, maybe especially to you, but also to you, Whiz, like, do you guys ever run into legal issues? Like, David, are you ever worried that, the FDA, I mean, not the FDA, the DEA might raid my lab? Or Whiz, are you ever worried like, I might get arrested one day while we're giving out the sacrament?
I invite them to do that.
Have you been arrested? Has anybody doing this been arrested?
Let me give you a quick political update, because like 2020 to 2022, I went to D.C. a couple times. I walked the halls. With Rick Doblin, sat in Kay Granger's office, and it was interesting because I gave my ibogaine 10-minute pitch, and Rick gave his pitch, and the chief of staff, I remember, looked at us and said, well, why didn't you lead with this? Pointing to me. I'm like, oh, wow. And Rick was like, well, you guys outlawed MDMA the most recent, so he blew the dust off of it type of thing. But I stopped going to D.C. around 2022. I won't use names, but I remember a congressman saying, Whiz, love what you're doing. All right, great. He said, well, you're going to have a problem with the big pharma and the alcohol and tobacco folks. I looked at him, I'm like, ain't that your job? What are you talking about? I'm going to have a problem. And then...
I don't understand. What did he mean by that? I don't even get that. What is he saying when he says
big pharma does not want these compounds legal, or they want to own them, right? I'm going to take ibogaine, make it ibogaine and charge you $20,000 a month for it. And alcohol, so this is infuriating to me too, and I was jumping out of my skin like I told you. The definition of a Schedule I drug is no therapeutic use and a high risk of addiction. I just defined alcohol and cigarettes, 100% legal. The ibogaine that I sat with was the most therapeutic thing of my existence, and it destroyed alcohol in my life. That's a felony. Just our government is good at naming things the exact opposite of what they are. So, new congressman, and this made me physically ill. You want to talk about policy? Because I was talking to this congressman, and I'm hitting him with the veteran suicide numbers. In the day we're going to spend together, approximately 22 veterans are going to check out. I hate putting this to the universe, but I'm going to say it. Could you imagine if 22 kids, not once a year, 22 kids were shot every day in one of our schools? This country would flip the hell out and do something. But since it's 22 veterans, thanks for your service. It sucks for that community. So I'm hitting this congressman with this veteran suicide numbers, and his eyes were glazing over. I'm like, are you kidding me? So I had to pull out my little briefing card that the coalition gave us to walk around with. I'm like, well, and this guy was an appropriator. I said, well, I forget the numbers, but the VA spends about $50 billion a year on PTSD. And he sat up and he's like, okay, all right, well, now you're talking. I'm like, are you kidding me? And he said, well, Whiz, so you were healed, right? I'm like, I think so. He said, well, if we heal these veterans from their PTSD, we're saving that $50 billion. And then the gears really start turning, and this guy goes, so if we heal these veterans, we don't have to pay them their disability payments. I about threw up. We have got to address this stuff now. I'm like, so a guy who's been suffering from PTSD for 10 years gets healed from these medicines and hasn't been able to have a job, you're going to stop paying the man? How about you call it a thank you payment, and I'm sorry payment on behalf of the American people? So we got to start answering these issues now. I met with Secretary Collins, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, 5 months ago, and he shook my hand and he said, Whiz, if anybody's going to do this, it's going to be us, and it'll be now. And then sadly, a couple months, I had his contact info and his chief of staff. And then sadly, I got a text from a close friend who said a veteran, 82nd Airborne, Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, killed himself. He was a son, a father, a husband. And this text said his parents knew about No Fallen Heroes. He knew about No Fallen Heroes. He was worried that if he sat with the medicine, the sacrament, he would lose his disability benefits, and he killed himself. I reached out to Secretary Collins directly. I reached out to his staff. They never said a word. So I posted a video on social media saying, where are you, Secretary Collins? You have to, there's 11 trials, I think, at the VA on psychedelics. We need somebody to stand up and go, ladies, fellas, if you go do this stuff to heal on your own, God bless you. We're not going to take any adverse reaction. This was a veteran who killed himself and knew he could have potentially healed, and he's dead. It's infuriating. So that cesspool of Washington, man, they care about numbers. That guy didn't move when I was talking about suicides. He cared about dollars. It was infuriating.
Can I ask you a question? Is this okay? I don't want
Yeah,
to
yeah, do it.
So you've had such a healing experience. That's not true for everyone. And so what might happen if someone hears your story and they think, I've really been suffering, and they go through, your Church for the Sacrament, and then they feel just as bad as they did?
So, that's a great question, Holly. Thank you. There are so many different healing modalities. Meditation, breath work, climbing a mountain in Nepal, walking on the beach. Radical trauma might need radical healing. And these compounds are probably considered radical healing. Now, knock on wood, I think we've crossed our century point. We've given 100 grants so far, and knock on wood, not a single person has come home and said, waste of time, or what the hell was that? Every one of those people to a person has had a transformational experience. Has there been challenging integrations? Oh, hell yeah. If you go home to the things that made you sick, you're going to be in a dogfight. So we have had people who have had those experiences, but knock on wood, and maybe I'm jinxing myself, we haven't had any stupendous adverse effect. Nobody's committed suicide. Nobody's gotten worse, in my experience. Have I heard stories? Yeah, but anecdotally. So I feel pretty solid about the work we're doing.
Well, could I speak to that? So, as someone who's run studies using psychedelics, it's absolutely the case that not everyone gets better, right? Some people, it's a sort of a normal distribution shifted over. Many people have a kind of meh experience, where they're no better off. Some people we do see in data have these positive, transformative experiences, and that's scientifically absolutely fascinating. Some people do, though, get worse, and some people very much so. So that's the spectrum of responses that we see in the data, and which you'll probably see. If you're doing this in larger numbers, you'll start to see more of this distribution.
But that's why I asked earlier about the whole group thing. Because we do ours in a retreat setting, right? It's not blindfold, two clinicians sitting there in a bring your own Buddha type of experience. And we do integration calls as a squadron. My phone's, I think, buzzing right now because all the text threads. After you go on a retreat, these are your squadron mates, man. When you see and share the release of trauma on these retreats, it's a collective. And we do buddy checks. I still have my thread from Marcus Luttrell. Anybody drink Black Rifle coffee? I went with Jared Taylor, Robert Gallery. I'm the veteran on the panel, athletes. So I went to Mexico with Robert Gallery. He was an All-American at Iowa, a linebacker, and played for the Raiders. I rode in the car from San Diego to Mexico with him, and I was sitting next to a 6'7", 350-pound dead human. He was just a dark iceberg. And now, if you've seen Robert Gallery in the media, he started his own foundation to get ibogaine to NFL players. And he has saved, Junior Seau, all these NFL guys, Aaron Rodriguez, who just horrible. These men were suffering from head trauma. So even these sacraments can potentially help athletes too.
Kat, when you look at what's happening at the state level, what states is there anything interesting happening at the state level? We have church, we have FDA, federal. What are states doing that is fascinating?
Yeah, I appreciate that what we're seeing happen on the local level. There are 20 plus states that have decriminalized psychedelics in some form or fashion, and I think that that's extremely important. Colorado also has a personal use component as well with its regulatory program. And I think that that's what I'm hoping begins to become infused in part of these conversations. I increasingly attending so many of these conversations where folks will say that they agree with decriminalization in principle, but then I don't necessarily see it manifested in the law itself. And so I share the concerns about risks that many of the folks at this table do, but my broader concern long term is that this conversation is going to evolve. The folks who are seen as like the leading faces of this movement will change. Media coverage of this will change. And I'm even seeing this with cannabis now as the kind of rescheduling conversation has taken over. I think a lot of the air in the room around decriminalization has been lost. Folks in the cannabis movement space were, full-throatedly supporting decriminalization 5 years ago. And because we've had this conversation around rescheduling and potential tax savings, commercial interests, that doesn't exist anymore. And I think that depending on the trajectory of these substances and who has access to these substances, we will start to see a recriminalization of these substances, particularly in certain communities. Some folks like to say for many communities, these substances are already decriminalized in a de facto manner because you all aren't being arrested for them. But that's not the case for all communities. And so I think that what we're seeing happening at the state and local level where there are community-based organizations, where folks who are actually starting to become a part of the policy making and advocacy, and there are groups that are forming, I think that that's critically important, not just for the start of this conversation, but for it to be sustained. One of the lessons that I've taken in cannabis, folks think that legalization is an event. And advocates will show up until the bill is passed, and then folks retreat. And then it's all of this implementation work that has to be done. And if folks aren't continuing to be a part of the conversation, if they're not at the table, the saying is that they're on the menu. And so I think that there's lots of opportunity for us not to just copy and paste what we're seeing out of the first couple of states that are developing these programs. There are grow and give models. We could mandate that essentially be a public monopoly on the distribution of these substances. It could exist like they do in Barcelona with the cannabis social clubs. I think that there are lots of different ways that we can craft regulations, and I think part of what I'd like to see is us to be meeting existing users of these substances where they are, not necessarily trying to create and I think that these things can coexist. How do we create pathways for folks who want and need to use these substances, but for folks who are already using these substances in their community? How do we reduce those harms? Because if we try to dissect all of these different issues without having an understanding of how they inform one another, I think we're going to be dealing with a lot of unintended consequences down the line.
Can I add a little bit more on? Sorry, I keep interrupting you. On the state side, right? We have some approaches to cannabis that are medical focused, and we have some that are more recreational focused. On the psychedelic side, right? We have 3 states that have taken a model of allowing licensed professionals, for lack of a better word, to provide these substances in a controlled setting. And they're along a spectrum from whether they are referring to them as medicines or not, right? But the closer you get to this model of providing medicines that would otherwise be FDA approved, or you would think they would be FDA approved, you end up like just not getting enough evidence to support the use of those products, right? So I wonder, David, like in Maryland, if there was a licensed pathway to access some of these psychedelic medicines, what would that do to your research studies, for example? I don't know how many Marylanders are the ones who are enrolling in your studies, but it's something that I worry about when I look at medical marijuana, where we still don't have very good evidence that it's helpful for which population, for which diseases and conditions, are we going to find ourselves in a similar position with psychedelics?
Because the data is so dirty? Because so many people are using it casually?
It's a variety of reasons. It shifts the incentives for whether you would need. So one of the most important functions of FDA is that it tells companies you may not market your product until you prove that it's safe and effective. So you can't profit from it until you prove it's safe and effective. That shifts the market incentive. So now companies say, well, we better get this evidence so that, and that evidence is what we all need as patients and what clinicians need in order to determine whether they should be making those recommendations. We don't have that evidence for medical marijuana, right? You go into a dispensary, you're talking to, the person behind the counter. They can say, well, I've used this, my friend used that, right? But your doctor is not going to be able to say, based on these studies, here's what I would recommend for you. This type, this dose, it's good for this condition, it's not good for that condition. And I'm very concerned about us getting in the same position with psychedelic medicines, as there's a lot of energy around these state approaches to access. We haven't talked about it at all here since it's so focused on psychedelics, of course, but there's a whole broader movement called the Right to Try movement. And this is for patients who are living with serious life-threatening diseases who say, we shouldn't have to ask FDA for permission to save our lives, right? It's a pretty good slogan. On the other hand, there are lots of snake oil salesmen out there who would be willing and ready to take advantage of people who are desperate. And we see it in the psychedelic context too, right? Lots of room for exploitation. So on the one hand, I'm pleased to see the state models have licensed approaches, oversight. People are thinking really carefully about that. But there's something beneficial about the FDA model where you say, we've rigorously studied these things. Here's what we know about them. Here's the conditions of safe use. And that doesn't mean that the medical model is the only correct model, but I worry about the medical model being used at the state level when it's not really the traditional FDA stamp of approval.
I think all of you want to respond to that. I'm going to go down, and we'll finish actually with and then we'll do audience questions. So we'll go David, Kat, Whiz, just to respond to that.
Yeah, so I don't think it's an either or. I think we can do the research, whether it be cannabis or psychedelics. We want to understand the risk-benefit profile, but also how these fascinating compounds interact with our nervous system in all sorts of different ways. Here we are, Harvard talking about this. There's discussions in DC. Millions of people are interested in these questions, and many of the questions have answers. The studies just need to be run. And so I think it's really important that regardless of how these policy frameworks play out, we need to continue to do the research to understand more about nature and ourselves.
Yeah, I wrote down yes and, because I do think that we can do both. I think that part of the challenge is with both of these substances is that we exist from a place of prohibition. There are lots of doctors and medical professionals who go through their entire education without really learning about how these substances interact with the human body and brain, and I understand the kind of power behind the FDA approval and the need to try to treat that exclusively. I think it could be not necessarily solved with a simple disclaimer, but I think that that's part of what needs to be instituted in some of these state programs is just education on what this is not. This is not FDA approved. This is not going through those normal channels. But I think that the pharmaceutical space has become monolithic in that way that I still want to advocate for additional models outside of pharma, but assuming that pharma can coexist.
It's just, again, it's so interesting sitting here because I couldn't even imagine this, but David had a great, pendulum slide, either one extreme or the other. There's got to be a happy medium, right? So I don't know if there's any hockey fans in here, but my brother Daniel Carcillo, 2-time Stanley Cup champ, 7 diagnosed concussions on the Blackhawks, healed with psilocybin. I bring him up because he opened a clinic in Portland called Experience Onward. And I went out, I think we sponsored 3 vets, and I went out to go on the retreat with him. And he's like, whoa, where are you going? I'm like, I'm going to hold space. He's like, you're not Oregon State certified. I'm like, man, I've held space and ceremony for 100. Nope, you're not Oregon certified. You can't hold space. I'm like, okay. So I had to go walk around Portland for 4 to 6 hours as veterans that I hope to hold space for, were in it. If you went to the middle of the Amazon right now and talked to a medicine woman, she doesn't know what Johns Hopkins is, right? She doesn't know what phase 3 trials are.
That's what Harvard is, though.
Yeah, exactly. So it's always interesting to me. First of all, I'd be talking like this, but I think in the West we have this massive ego. Like, we just discovered these compounds. Let's study them for the next 20 years. Are you insane? The Bowitti in Gabon would be like, what? So there's got to be a happy medium. I get safety, efficacy, and everything like that, but why don't we just go listen to some of these people too? I mean, and again, if I heard me talking like this 5 years ago, I would have kicked my own ass. But that shows the transformational power of at least what happened to me and a lot of people. But, maybe we can rein in the ego a little bit and pretend that we have all the answers and demand all of these trials as 22 men and women who serve this country will cease to exist today. And it's heartbreaking. So, a summary slide from Whiz. The topic of this panel was psychedelic access, faster or slower. We are going backwards when we're having a mass shooting every day. Speed is relative, right? I've gone Mach 1.8 in my life, which was 1,400 miles per hour. We are going way too slow as veterans are dying, period.
All right, we're going to do some questions. We'll start right here, and then go to one back there. We'll probably have time for 2 or 3, so if there's anyone else.
Thanks very much. Really interesting. I'm Elisa Weitzman, faculty at Harvard Med, director of research for pediatric addiction medicine in Boston Children's Hospital. My question's about something that we haven't addressed, even though all of you have referenced it, which is, are we talking about a compound or are we talking about a treatment that also includes psychosocial support services, integration, et cetera? And if it's the latter, how are we constructing trials, right, to generate evidence around that? And then what's the path forward in terms of insurance reimbursement, et cetera? I'm an optimistic cynic. I think there's a lot of promise in this area, but I'm very cynical that we do something like adequately support integration services, meaning making the community infrastructure service model that might be required as part of the treatment.
David, you want to start with that?
Sure. So I think it's important to get substance specific because the psychosocial support wrapper will differ wildly across substances. So I don't know if in your mind you were thinking about something like MDMA, which as it's currently construed has this extremely intensive exposure-like psychotherapeutic package, or something like ketamine, which has close to 0. And take psilocybin, it's study specific. So some studies are pairing evidence-based psychotherapies explicitly, like CBT, for example, with the psilocybin experiences before, during, after. Others are doing a more minimal model to varying extents. And so I think what we're able to see now as the results for more studies come in and as they're hopefully carefully describing the nature of the psychosocial support model or psychotherapy that they're doing, we can determine how big of an impact it makes, right? Is it mostly the pharmacotherapy and then there's a little bit of wiggle room, or is it massively impacted by the kind of psychotherapy? And I suspect that will vary by substance as well.
In the back with the hat. Just go ahead, quickly follow up.
I was just going to say that seems to me to be very diagnosis specific also. Yeah. So it's the combination of what's the diagnosis or what problem are we trying to address? Is it trauma? Is it a brain injury, from concussion? And what's the substance?
Yeah. And dose. I mean, there's a lot of variables that go into this, that getting specific.
I have somewhat of a theoretical question. We're kind of talking in 2 separate domains, spiritual and medical. And with something like depression, do we think that it makes sense to have a purely medical approach to something like that, or should there be some sort of space, like when we're talking about FDA calling things safe and efficacious? We don't have that sort of standard for like the sacrament of communion, going to church. Like there are other spaces for things that are seen as not medical but spiritual sort of realms to address these things through. And is there space for that to be somewhat integrated into a more medical approach? But then also for Kat, more specifically, just about the commercialization, there's so much really interesting incentives and pressures. Like if you walk into a dispensary, a recent sign that I saw was like, come in 3 times and spend $100 and you'll get this discount. And it's like, how can we be possibly allowing that sort of like incentive structure with something that it's not just like popcorn and it has like some addictive potential. So like how do you balance those sort of things where if we want to have a little bit more reduced safety and efficacy standards for some of these things, but we also don't want to run into those pretty obviously predatory and higher risk situations?
Well, you take me, go first.
Yeah. This one seems a little bit simpler, but I might be eating those words. But I think that there has to be some level of oversight and regulation. I'm not imagining a free-for-all. I think that decriminalization has to be like a core component of these frameworks. But when I use the term regulation, I'm thinking about what types of practices and policies can mitigate risks related to the use of these substances. And so for cannabis, for example, there are certain jurisdictions that outlaw that type of those types of discounts or sales, different types of advertising. I do think that those types of things are appropriate, and we can always evolve and change. I think that with cannabis, we went too far too fast. And now I'm seeing both the over-commercialization of cannabis and simultaneously the over-regulation of cannabis in certain areas, in other areas where there are complete gaps. And so I think it requires a delicate balancing act, but I don't want to suggest in any way that I think that these different practices should come without any type of oversight or enforcement. I think the challenge is when there's a disconnect between government and community, and I think a lot of this oversight and enforcement can actually be community-led. If communities are resourced to serve as peer-to-peer educators and to provide harm reduction and supportive services to one another, I think it would be much more well-received when it's coming from peer-to-peer than from government, who we know we don't and can't necessarily trust on these issues.
Holly, did you want to take the first piece of that?
Very, very briefly, right? So if you have depression as diagnosed, through the DSM or something, right? There are validated measures that you would use in your clinical trial to evaluate whether somebody's condition had improved or not. Your question seems to be bigger picture than that, right? Like if somebody is depressed because of the state of the world, right? We should all be depressed about what's going on. That's a different kind of, that's not diagnosable in the same way. It wouldn't be measured in the same way. So FDA is not going to be dealing with that kind of disorder or that kind of intervention to treat that kind of disorder, right? So we're already, when we're in the FDA space, in the medicalized model, right? Like you have a clinical diagnosis and you're having a clinical intervention.
Last question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Deepak Sharma, Case Western Reserve University. I have a kind of a devil's advocate sort of question, which is that, it seems to me that there's a kind of elephant in the room, which is that it was really, when these substances became scheduled, was a result of what I would call kind of an implantation of biopower that really was a response to kind of racism and thought moderation, right? And so these substances became medicalized because they became Schedule I, and they certainly weren't before that. And so it seems like. So I understand that we're at the law school, this is bioethics, and that many of you work in the medical context, but it seems so arbitrary, or as a result of this kind of deployment of medicine really for the sake of thought moderation and racism, that we're still thinking about and worrying about the kind of the medical paradigms being the one that we need to bow to, right? And so it just like it's and then I think also about
Let's get to the question.
well, so the question is that the question is like we're thinking about these issues, but shouldn't we just be worrying first about and trying to reject the very Schedule I formation that existed and questioning that first, right? And I think that Kat, you've addressed that to some degree, and I think Whiz, you're addressing that, but like accepting the medical
That's great. Okay,
Yeah.
Whiz, do you want to respond to that?
You know how I feel. I mean, and it's really interesting because, let's just two psychedelic revolutions, in my opinion. The first one, late 60s, early 70s, all of these were legal, right? We talked about MDMA, it jumped the couch and, made it to Dallas type of thing. But a bunch of folks, or actually one man, said, go to the other side of the planet and kill the yellow man. No, I don't want to. Why? Well, he took these mushrooms, and I love everybody. Okay, well, now those are a felony. Here's your rifle. Now go kill people. It's really interesting to me that veterans are part of this second psychedelic revolution and calling out the hypocrisy of alcohol and drugs are 100% legal. They will kill you, and they're addictive. And what I did was anti-addictive and the most therapeutic thing. It's disgusting, and it reeks to high heaven. But David, you were asking, big pharma. There's no way that the CEO of Pfizer is sitting on the 12th floor, sitting on his pile of money, going, "We're going to let some little startup or whatever heal generalized anxiety disorder." Or Vic and I, we're in Demerex. We're using noribogaine to cure alcohol use disorder, right? So the Schedule I thing it's rude, it's offensive to anybody with a brain. They are labeling things the exact opposite of what they are, and it needs to change. It's a circular firing squad, my friend. When I go to the VA, they're like, "Whiz, we love what you're doing. You need to go talk to the lawmakers." I talk to the lawmakers, and they say, "Whiz, you got to talk to the VA." I'm like, it's a circular firing squad. Who is in the middle of this thing that's going to stand up and say, "Go, it's cool, let's get this done"? And it's maddening to me. That's long answer to David's question. That's why I started my church, is because I'm sick of all of this stuff, and we're just going to heal people on our own if we need to.
All right, thank you all for coming. That was so lively.